Welcome back, Deep Divers. Today we're gonna dive deep into something that's, well, let's just say a topic that often gets misunderstood. Homosexuality in Islamic societies.
Oh, this is going to be fascinating.
I know, right? And our guide for this journey is a book called, get this, Islamic Homosexualities, Culture, History, and Literature.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's not just like one person's take, it's a whole collection of essays by different scholars.
So we're getting a lot of different perspectives then.
Exactly. Different regions, different time periods, the whole shebang.
Sounds comprehensive.
It is.
Oh.
And get this, the book basically argues that the idea of like a gay identity as like, this fixed thing,
Right.
it's actually a pretty recent Western invention.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it really challenges you to think outside the box. So get ready, because we're about to unpack how various Islamic societies have understood and experienced same-sex relations across, like, centuries.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. So the book argues that in many Islamic societies, same-sex relationships weren't always seen as, like, this core part of who you are.
Okay. Yeah, I see where you're going with this. Like,
Yeah.
in the West, we tend to define people based on their sexual orientation, right?
Right. But the book says in some Islamic societies, things like your age and your social status actually played a bigger role in how these relationships were understood.
So your sexual role could actually change as you got older.
It's a completely different framework.
Wow, that's fascinating.
The book even uses terms like status-differentiated homosexuality and gender-defined roles.
Those are new ones.
And speaking of mind-blowing examples, the book talks about these, get this, boy dancers of 19th century Uzbekistan.
Boy dancers. Okay, now I'm intrigued.
So basically, young men were performing for an audience of men,
Right.
but they weren't necessarily seen as, like, gay in the way we think of it today.
So how are they perceived?
It's all about how different cultures define these things.
Yeah. Makes you realize how much our own cultural lens shapes our understanding, right?
Totally. And the book traces how these perceptions started to change when Western ideas, began influencing Islamic societies, starting like in the 19th and 20th centuries.
So it's like Western ideas about sexuality started to filter in and change things.
It's like a ripple effect. And then there's this other example. The book talks about this tradition of the Balkan sworn virgin.
Okay, I've heard of those. But remind me, what's a Balkan sworn virgin?
So these women would actually choose to, like, take on male social roles.
Oh, right.
Sometimes for economic reasons, like inheriting property or to protect their families. It really, like, makes you question our rigid ideas about gender,
For sure. It shows how diverse human experiences can be.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting because, it cautions us against just imposing Western categories onto other cultures. Like, what we consider male or female might not translate in the same way.
Right. It's about understanding the context.
And speaking of challenging norms, the book also looks at this incredible tradition in Islamic mystical literature.
Like poetry.
Yeah, especially Sufi poetry. And get this, they use romantic love between men as like a metaphor for divine love.
Wow, that's powerful.
Right. They have these stunning poems where the yearning for a beloved becomes a symbol of like the soul yearning for God. Really intense stuff.
So even in a religious context, we see these expressions of same-sex love, but with a completely different interpretation.
And to bring things a little closer to home, to the present day, the book even gives us this glimpse into contemporary gay life in Pakistan, specifically in Karachi.
Karachi.
It's a really vivid account of like the challenges and opportunities faced by gay men there.
I'm sure it's a good place situation.
It is. And what's really interesting is that it also talks about how some AIDS education organizations are working within like Islamic frameworks to address this really critical health issue.
So they're finding ways to work within the existing cultural and religious structures?
Yeah. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to unpack.
One of the things that really struck me was how the book traces this idea of the modern homosexual, as a concept.
Yeah, like when did we start thinking about being gay as like a fixed identity?
Exactly. Like it's so ingrained in our thinking now. But
it is.
But the book argues that this idea of, homosexual as like this distinct identity with a specific sexual orientation, it really only gained traction in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Relatively recently then.
Super recent. And it all started in the West.
Interesting.
Tied up with, the rise of medical and psychological thinking about sexuality.
So before that, like people weren't going around labeling themselves gay or straight.
It's not that same-sex relationships didn't exist, but they were understood and experienced in completely different ways.
Right, and that's what this book is really pushing us to consider.
Yeah, like our modern categories, they just don't fit when you look at other cultures and historical periods.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly. And the book dives into all these historical examples that just blow your mind.
Okay, give me the juicy details.
All right, so remember that term we touched on earlier, status-differentiated homosexuality?
Yeah, it's a mouthful, but I'm starting to get the gist.
Well, it helps explain how in some cultures, a man might have same-sex relationships when he was younger.
Yeah.
But then, as he got older, his status changed, and then he would shift to heterosexual relationships.
So it's all about, like, where you are in life.
Exactly. Sexuality wasn't seen as this fixed thing. It was fluid.
It was like playing different roles.
And the book suggests that this kind of fluidity existed in some Islamic societies, too.
Wow. Even if it wasn't always talked about openly.
Right.
And this is where it gets even more interesting.
Okay. I'm hooked.
The book delves into all these different terms used in Islamic cultures to describe same-sex relationships.
So like different words for different kinds of relationships.
Exactly. And get this, many of these terms don't even have a direct equivalent in English. Well, for example, there's this word luth, which is sometimes translated as sodomite, but honestly, that translation just doesn't capture the nuance.
It's like trying to squeeze a whole ocean into a teacup.
Exactly. And then bam, the 19th and 20th centuries hit.
Uh-oh.
And Western ideas about sexuality, they come crashing in, bringing all their baggage.
Oh, boy.
Like, the book argues that the rise of sexology in the West, with this whole focus on classifying everything,
Right.
it led to homosexuality being labeled as a pathology, like a mental illness.
A disease, basically.
And guess what? These ideas spread like wildfire. They reached Islamic societies, too.
So we're talking about a major cultural shift here.
Huge. And it's a shift away from understanding same-sex relations through, like, traditional Islamic frameworks and toward viewing them through this new, like, medicalized, often negative lens.
It's almost like imposing a new set of values onto another culture.
And that's just the beginning. The book lays out all these specific historical examples that really bring these concepts to life.
Okay, I'm ready for some more mind-blowing stories.
Okay, so let's take a trip back to medieval Egypt
Oh, time travel.
and meet the Mamluks.
Who were the Mamluks?
So imagine this warrior class mostly made up of slave soldiers, and they were recruited from non-Muslim lands.
Okay.
So they lived in this really unique social environment, often isolated from women.
I see where this is going.
Right, so the book explains how same-sex relations between older Mamluk soldiers and younger recruits weren't uncommon.
That makes sense in that context.
But here's the thing, it wasn't considered like a defining identity. As these Mamluks climbed the ranks, they were expected to marry women and start families.
So their sexual roles were fluid, changing with their age and status.
It's like a whole different social script than what we're used to in the West.
Totally.
And speaking of unique social structures, the book also dives into eunuch slavery.
Eunuchs,
Oh, wow. So remind me, who were eunuchs?
they were men who had been castrated, often as children.
Right, and they held positions of power in households and royal courts, but their unique status, it placed them outside of typical marriage and family structures.
So that created all sorts of possibilities for their, sexual lives.
Right. Are we talking about same-sex relationships among eunuchs?
Well, the book points out that their experiences were diverse. Some were sexually active, others weren't.
Okay.
Some had casual encounters while others formed long-term partnerships.
It's a mixed bag then.
The point is, it's complicated, and it defies simple categorization.
It's like we keep hitting this wall with our modern categories.
We do, and remember that tradition of the Balkan-sworn virgin we talked about earlier?
Oh yeah, those women who chose to live as men.
They pop up again here as another example of how fluid gender roles could be.
Sometimes it was for economic reasons, sometimes for family to avoid marriage.
It's fascinating how they defied gender expectations.
Right, and hold on, there's another group that fits into this discussion.
Okay, who's that?
The Hazaras in South Asia.
Okay.
The book explains they're often described as transgender or third gender.
I've heard that term before.
They often dress and act in feminine ways, but their identity, it might not fit neatly into our Western understanding of male or female.
It's like they're breaking down those binary categories.
Exactly. And their presence in a region with a significant Muslim population, it really forces us to expand our understanding of gender and sexuality.
It's a good reminder that the world is much more diverse than we often realize.
And the book stresses the importance of approaching these topics with sensitivity and respect.
Yeah, like avoiding that urge to impose our own cultural baggage onto others.
It's about understanding, not judging.
And this leads us to another crucial point the book makes about interpretation.
Okay, I'm listening.
It argues that how we understand same-sex relations in Islamic societies, it's often shaped by Western scholars and their interpretations.
So like the lens we use to look at history matters.
It matters a lot. The book points out that some scholars have focused on texts that condemn homosexuality,
Right.
while overlooking other evidence that might suggest a more tolerant or accepting attitude.
It's like cherry picking the evidence to fit a certain narrative.
Exactly. And the book encourages us to question those dominant narratives. And to consider alternative interpretations.
It's like we're being asked to be more critical thinkers, to dig deeper.
And that's what makes this book so exciting. It's not giving us easy answers. It's pushing us to ask better questions.
I like that. Okay, so we've got this whole historical backdrop, but how does it connect to what's happening today? I'm dying to hear about contemporary gay life in Islamic societies.
Well, get ready for a trip to Karachi, Pakistan.
Karachi, okay.
The book dedicates a whole chapter to this vibrant city and its underground gay scene.
Underground, that sounds kind of intense.
It is. The author paints this picture of a complex world, where gay men face real challenges.
Because homosexuality is illegal in Pakistan, right?
Right. It's illegal and it's taboo, but these guys are finding ways to live authentically.
Even in the face of those challenges.
Exactly. They're creating spaces for themselves. They're building networks for support and information.
So they're finding ways to connect.
They are. And here's where it gets really interesting. The author talks about these ungay relationships that exist in Karachi.
Ungay relationships, what's that all about?
It's a fascinating concept. He suggests that these relationships, often within families or close friendships,
Okay.
they offer a way for gay men to experience intimacy and connection when being openly gay is impossible.
So it's like a different way of navigating those desires.
Exactly. It challenges our Western idea of coming out, like maybe there are other ways to integrate your desires and find fulfillment.
Without necessarily fitting into that mold.
Exactly. It highlights how cultural norms and expectations shape people's experiences.
It reminds us that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to being gay.
And that's a really important message to keep in mind as we continue this conversation.
Okay, so we've gone from ancient Egypt to modern-day Pakistan, and it's clear that the story of homosexuality in Islamic societies is just incredibly diverse and complex.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
But wait, we haven't even touched on the AIDS epidemic and how that's impacted these communities.
You're right. That's a whole other layer.
And the book dives into the work of organizations that are on the front lines of HIV/AIDS prevention in Islamic contexts.
Organizations like Pink Triangle in Malaysia and the NAS Project.
It's amazing to think about the challenges they face tackling such a sensitive issue within cultures where homosexuality is often taboo.
It takes real courage and resilience.
Okay, so we've journeyed through centuries of history and different cultures, landed squarely in the present day. But we kind of skipped over this one fascinating part of the book.
We did. We haven't really talked about Islamic mystical literature and how it portrays same-sex love, have we?
It's almost like a whole secret world within Islam that most people don't even know about.
It's often overlooked, but the book really dives into how romantic love between men, it's used as this metaphor for divine love in Sufi poetry.
Like they're taking something that might be considered taboo and turning it into this incredibly powerful spiritual expression.
It's really quite beautiful how they do it too. The book gives some great examples of Sufi poems, where the longing for the beloved becomes a symbol of the soul's longing for God.
I love that idea, using the language of romantic love to express this deep spiritual yearning.
And it's important to remember that this wasn't just, a literary device. These poems were reflecting real-world practices and beliefs within Sufi traditions.
So it wasn't all just symbolic. It had real-world implications. Tell me more about that.
Well, some Sufi orders, they actually encouraged spiritual mentorship between men.
Okay.
So an older, more experienced mentor would guide a younger disciple on his spiritual path. And these relationships often involved, intense emotional bonds and expressions of affection.
Which you could totally interpret through the lens of those romantic poems we were just talking about.
Right. And the book really stresses that trying to, force these historical practices into our modern categories of gay or straight, it just misses the point.
Like trying to shove a square peg into a round hole. It doesn't work.
We need to be careful about imposing our own cultural assumptions onto other times and places.
Totally. So we've got this tradition of Sufi poetry, celebrating same-sex love as a metaphor for divine love. But what about, Islamic legal traditions? How have they dealt with same-sex relations?
Well, that's where things get a little trickier, because Islamic jurisprudence, like any legal system, it's evolved over time.
And I'm guessing it varies across different regions too, right?
Exactly. The book points out that while the Quran condemns the act of sodomy, its interpretation and how it's been applied, it's varied a lot among legal scholars.
Okay, so there's no single, like, Islamic view on this? It's more nuanced than that?
Much more. You've got different schools of thought within Islamic legal traditions.
Got it. So give me an example of how these interpretations might differ.
Sure. Some scholars, they've argued that the Quranic prohibition, it's specifically talking about anal penetration.
Okay.
While other forms of sexual contact between men, they might not be considered as severe.
It's not a black and white issue then. There's a lot of gray area.
Exactly. And it's worth pointing out that the legal rulings often focused on the act itself rather than the individual's identities or desires.
So it's not about labeling someone as gay, it's about the specific action.
Right, which is a really important distinction because it challenges our modern Western obsession with sexual orientation as a, core part of who a person is.
So in some Islamic legal contexts, the act itself was what mattered, not someone's perceived identity.
Right. It's a completely different way of thinking about things.
So we've got this mix of, religious texts, legal interpretations, cultural practices. It's all intertwined. But let's be real for a second. Homosexuality is illegal in a lot of Muslim-majority countries today. The book doesn't shy away from that.
No, it acknowledges the very real dangers and discrimination faced by LGBTQ plus people in these contexts.
And then that's something we can't ignore.
Absolutely not. But the book also emphasizes that laws and social attitudes, they're not static. They're constantly evolving.
There's always hope for change.
And we are seeing LGBTQ plus activism emerging in some Islamic contexts.
Yeah.
Remember those organizations we talked about earlier, like Pink Triangle in Malaysia and the Nas Project?
Yeah.
They're working within Islamic frameworks to promote HIV/AIDS awareness and prevention.
They're doing incredibly important work in, really challenging circumstances.
It's inspiring to see their dedication.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways we want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think this book really drives home the incredible complexity and diversity of human sexuality. It challenges this notion of, one monolithic Islamic view on same-sex relations.
It's like we've been looking at this whole topic through the wrong lens.
The book encourages us to be more nuanced, more sensitive, more open to different interpretations and experiences.
To walk a mile in someone else's shoes.
Exactly.
And it's a call for greater understanding and empathy for LGBTQ plus individuals in Islamic contexts.
Absolutely. To recognize the challenges they face and to celebrate their resilience.
It's been an amazing journey exploring this topic, and I hope our listeners are walking away with a fresh perspective on this often misunderstood topic. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.